What is a building? Is it the specific materials and proportions, or is it the spirit of the relation between what comprises that?
What I love about the UK is they have very different schools, which have very different personalities and produce different types of architects.
On an existential level, I think I've always been afraid of entropy.
It's not going to stay like that forever. It's not possible.
When you're hiring for your studio, is there a type of student or type of school that you prefer to hire from?
Ooh, that's giving away secrets.
I'm speaking today with the architect and educator, Aram Mooradian. Aram teaches at the University of Cambridge, set up his own architecture studio in 2017, and his biggest project to date is redesigning Armenia's second biggest city. Aram, it's good to have you with me.
Thank you very much.
Take me back to the start.
At the very beginning, I guess I'm the son of journalists, and they were moving around a lot. So I was born in Amsterdam in the late 80s, and I would sort of follow my father's work around. So I, as a child, moved from European city to European city. So I lived in the Netherlands twice, I lived in Germany twice, France for a brief period, and eventually the UK. And that's where I've been ever since.
What kind of journalists were they?
So my father was a economic journalist. So when he started out, he would specialize in oil. My parents actually met because they were traveling together as he would fly to OPEC meeting to OPEC meeting and things like this. I think when the Berlin Wall fell, it seemed like a good time to move to Germany. So as a young child, we moved to Germany just outside Frankfurt, which I guess was the economic hub. And I spent some time there. It's probably no surprise that I'm an architect. After you've jumped from house to house to house, you want some stability. And I guess it is also quite stimulating seeing all of these different ways of living as a young child.
I mean, Amsterdam is a city built on water, and Frankfurt is a city that was rebuilt completely.
Exactly right, yeah. I mean, and also my parents at different points built their own houses. I don't know why they did, because as soon as they finished, they would move. So I think that there was always that sense of living amongst buildings in places that were under constant renewal and change. I think that's very much in the spirit of Dutch architecture even today. It's a country that is, always very progressive in terms of its architecture. And Germany had to completely rebuild itself. So I think from that spirit, it's no surprise, really.
Do you have a particular fondness for one or the other?
I don't. I mean, I think I definitely have a curiosity, which I've carried with me today, for other systems of inhabiting. I was in Amsterdam last week and walked past the old house that I grew up in and walked over these canals, and you can really read the growth of the city and the plan of Amsterdam. Is quite amazing. It started with this, just one little dam, and they were given a trading license, and then it very quickly grew, and they were very pragmatic engineers. So the whole city's planned like a sort of sweeping array of canals, right? And they started on one end, and then they would start building, and then the population or the economy would go down, it would stop for a while, and then continue. So you can really read the age of the city in Amsterdam, which I think is quite remarkable. And the other half of my father's father was fled the Ottoman Empire, and traveled a lot. As a child, went through Syria, Cyprus, eventually growing up in France, and then moving to the US at some point. Encountering these sort of traces of that Armenian diaspora side, wherever you go, is also something that's always surprising. So, for example, in Amsterdam, I was walking around, and sure enough, there's a 17th century warehouse that was converted by Armenian merchants who had the monopoly on the silk trade with Persia, and a little bridge called the Armenian Bridge. So, you always realize that, in particularly places like Amsterdam, their adjacency to the oceans, they're so connected to all these other parts of the world and all of these other human stories. And that's one thing that on the one hand, I can see that in my own background, the way that family members and myself had to move from place to place and adapt and interact with new places. But all cities have that. And, I've settled in London, and I think London is one of the most incredible evidences of that interconnectivity with the rest of the world.
Architecturally, it's more of an accumulation than a plan.
Completely. I mean, they tried to have a plan after the fire, and it didn't work because nobody wanted to give up their property. But as a result of that, I think you have an incredibly rich city that has an infinite number of layers in it. Whether it's going to Spitalfields and seeing merchants' houses built by Huguenots, or going to Charterhouse and seeing sort of fragments of medieval London next to the Barbican Centre. It's an extraordinary mix of different artifacts.
I'm reminded of how lucky we are when I travel to America, because the majority of cities there are built using the grid system, which for getting around is quite helpful.
Yeah.
First Street, 22nd Street, the avenues, the way they intersect. But in terms of interest, it's severely lacking, I think, as you said, intrigue.
Yeah, I suppose the thing about grids is that you can see where you're going, right? Whereas, if you remove that sense of navigation, the extreme example is Venice, where, unfortunately, now we have Google Maps and you can find your way around. But, let's say 15 years ago you went and you would be completely lost. That produced a certain kind of magic in the cities, never quite understanding what's behind the thing in front of you. I think that is a richness that can't always be designed from scratch. It's just the accumulation of time, which produces that quality, I think.
At which age did you come to the United Kingdom?
I was about 10. I went to an international school. So even though I lived here a very long time, I don't necessarily sound very English, or it's a bit muddled. But it was quite an interesting experience because you had an incredible range of individuals. You had children whose parents were oligarchs. You had children whose parents, worked in the local shop. You had people from all walks of life, all over the world, coming for different lengths of time. So I think when I think about architecture, it's very much, a job where you have to have a lot of empathy, and you have to, with each client, work to understand them. And that's a human skill. And you interact with the entire range of society, whether it's a wealthy client. Most people who build have some form of power, right? So you're interacting with, the wealthier or the more powerful elements of society. You're also interacting with builders and workers and neighbors and communities. So in that sense, I think reflecting on my past, I do wonder whether that curiosity about people, or that I hope skill in interacting with people from different walks of life, is something that has come from my background.
Because when you studied architecture, were these kind of interpersonal skills taught to you?
In a funny way, I suppose you're always asked to respond to a brief as a student. You're given a length of time to produce a project, and if you have a mildly responsible tutor, they'll probably give you a client that you're supposed to be representing. But actually interacting with people who might tell you to do something that you don't want to do necessarily as a visionary student is something that takes a bit more time. And it's more, once you get into practice, I think you really get tested in terms of how you have to be a bit of a diplomat. I mean, there's a great a document which has lots of the correspondence of the architect, the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and when he was building Falling Water, which was one of his masterpieces. And it's incredible how you can see when reading his letters how he changes his voice, whether he's speaking to the Kaufmans, his clients, whether he's speaking to the builder, whether he's speaking to local residents. You can see how his voice completely changes with each interaction, because he has to somehow pull all these people together to participate in this vision to make this thing happen. Because if you don't bring all these people together, it will never happen, or it'll be an ugly building. So I think, it is, whether it's taught to you or not, I don't know that it's something that can be taught as a lesson. I think it's something that you learn through repeated trials.
And in a sense, is the life of an architect similar to that of a life of a lawyer, insofar as you might be asked by a client, you might have to take a side with a client that you may personally believe to be the wrong way?
It's like a dance. You have to kind of work with each other. You make a decision when you set up a practice about what kind of work you do. And, yes, you start out and you're desperate and you'll take anything on. But you always have to make it work for the client, and you always have to make it work for yourself in terms of feeling that you are contributing something, producing quality. You should always be, as your career trajectory progresses, moving to a point where those things become closer and closer together. So is it like being a lawyer? It's more than that, because there's a bit more romance involved. And when you can romance clients, use your empathy to imagine how they might live and get more out of their life and improve their lives. So you're often using a mirror to show them different ways that they can live. So hopefully bring the two of you closer together through that dance.
Because you're balancing their vision with your potential vision, but then each of you respectively have to weigh up aesthetics and utility of every decision in the process.
Yes, and a lot of architects will be frustrated with clients and say like, oh, they don't want to spend enough money, or they're cheap, or things like that. But I often think, and I suppose the reason why I'm saying this is because the economic, especially in the UK, the economic side of building is becoming more and more and more in the foreground. I think you can do things quite economically, and there's actually creativity in that. And there's always scope for imagination. So,
talk to me about your studies at the Architecture Association.
I remember, surveying architecture schools to study at when I was, 16, 17. I'd always wanted to be an architect. I was completely obsessed.
At which age did you become obsessed and want that career?
I think it must have been 10 or something.
Okay.
I remember my mother coming back from some travels and buying this architecture pop-up book, which I think you can still buy. Yeah. And you open it up and it's sort of the Sydney Opera House, and then it folds away, and you open it up and it's Falling Water. And
it's very interesting. The architect for the Sydney Opera House also did a dismally dull bridge and building in Durham. And
really?
It's one of my favourite stories. You just would never... Usually architects have I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, generally a sense of style that tends to pervade their work.
Yeah.
But in this example...
you don't get all of them right, do you? So I applied to all of these different schools, and I think I didn't have great success getting into any. And I was very depressed about this. And I applied to, and I had great grades, I had portfolio. I applied to the Architectural Association, which at that time was much smaller than it is now. I think it had 500 students. And it was relaxed and it was international. And I felt this incredible sense of relief. I thought, you know what? This place really feels like it matches me. And it was, I remember I was interviewed very informally by various teachers. There was an admin person, a tutor, and there was one of the students there in the interview. And it had this, I started learning about the tradition of AA, which started as a members club. So there were some frustrated architecture apprentices who weren't happy with the exploitative nature of architectural training. So they wanted a space where they could go and meet and discuss architecture free of the shackles of their masters. And that club, which was set up as a democracy, with members who voted for their head, slowly became, one of the great schools of architecture in the world. And Zaha Hadid, who we were talking about earlier, Norman Foster taught there, Richard Rogers studied there, you name it. The number of people who've moved through this institution, it's really quite incredible. And its structure is unique. So students vote for their head. So it was just the most inspiring system of education, where as a student you felt that you had to take responsibility for the way that you were educated, because you were voting for the leadership. And this system it's not without its faults, but it survived this long. And I do think they, for example, doesn't give grades. So the only way that you can measure your success is through presenting your work to other people, through reflecting on your own successes. It's an incredible way of educating that really, I think, makes people aim for the right things in their work rather than trying to just achieve points.
Is there any kind of pass-fail paradigm at all?
There is pass and there's fail. So there are, I think, I think there are nuances. I think in your essays you might get a high pass, something like that. I don't know, maybe it's changed slightly since.
But they stay away from, applying numbers.
Precisely, yeah. So, when I was a student there were lots of a very tumultuous period where students were holding big community meetings because the AA, which had always survived without giving degrees, because simply graduating from the AA and getting its certificate was prestigious enough that any architect in the world would hire you. And the decision was made to turn the AA into a university, which meant it had to increase its student numbers and conform to certain regulatory requirements. And in a way, the fear was from the students at that time that, it's a thin end of the wedge, that marking systems would slowly come in. And I think somehow, I don't know how, maybe it's just the legacy of the school. It's managed to hold on to some of those traditions and those ways of teaching that are focused more on values and portfolio rather than numerical scoring of quite subjective things.
So in a sense, it seems that getting into the school in the first place is the most important thing. If there are no marks per se following that, and employers look to graduates of the school and the reputation of the school as an indication of their inherent quality, was there an extent to which, when you got a place, you thought, I've made it, so to speak?
Maybe. I think you definitely, the school, just like Oxbridge in a way, as soon as you enter, you are convinced by the institution that this is a great place to be. And there was also a sense that there was no shame in dropping out. There was no shame in failing. Failure was not necessarily a bad thing. So, I had a slightly different set of values, I think. It did definitely build everybody up to expect that as soon as they graduated, they were going to be the next Rem Koolhaas, or they were going to be the next Norman Foster, or they were going to be the next. So it definitely, there was a degree of that going on.
And what kind of projects did you work on whilst at the school?
Quite a variety. I mean, so the way it works in most architecture schools is that you'll get a tutor for a year, and they will, or at least this is the kind of AA model that is shared by a lot of other schools now. And there'll be a group of 12 students, more or less, and a tutor, and they will give you a brief, and they pitch the briefs in the beginning of the year, and you apply to the different studios. So I thought, you know what, I'm here once at this school. I'm going to try lots of different things. So, you know, one year you're doing an extension to the Victoria and Albert Museum. The next year you're doing a hotel in Las Vegas. And I think one amazing...
I'm trying not to get them mixed up.
Yeah. Well, that would be quite interesting. I think, I mean, most museums are becoming a bit like Las Vegas now anyway, but that's another conversation. I think one of the things that I really learned there was the importance of travel. You know, it's getting more difficult now because of an awareness of carbon and things like this. But, you know, they always paired these briefs with a trip to immerse yourself in the site or the place, or to look at buildings. So I think that aspect of architectural education, of, you know, not designing something remotely, but actually kind of having an awareness of the context and really embedding yourself in it, is something that they, I think, instilled in me. And it's probably that sense of the importance of really getting into local context is something that's very much part of my own work.
How can you even pretend to understand a place if you've never been there?
Completely. I mean, when I was growing up, I remember I was at a barbecue or cocktail party or something like that with my family, and there was this architect called Headley who was about 97 years old, and he was telling me that he, in the 50s and 60s, was designing bridges and buildings in the Far East without ever having been there or seen any of the buildings once they were done. Just sort of doing designs and sending them off. So maybe that's why Jon Utzon did the bridge that you were talking about.
Maybe I'll have to look into that. Let's have that conversation regarding, I joked, you don't want to mix up the Las Vegas hotel with the V&A extension. And you said, well, a lot of art galleries now are kind of turning into Las Vegas hotels. What did you mean by that exactly?
I guess a lot of my professional background and training, let's say in the early years, was working with art museums and galleries and things like that. And, you know, a lot of public institutions now, it's very much about getting bums in seats or getting people through the door. Galleries are often designed as circuits. The light is highly controlled, so you don't want too much daylight. I know some art galleries where they have a sensor outside so that they can mimic more or less the quality of the daylight outside, inside, but can tweak it so that it's just right for the paintings and things. So there's this kind of control, highly controlled spaces.
It's a panopticon, Bentham, Foucault nature to this.
Yeah, I guess so. And it's also, you know, I mean, if you look at the Tate, there's this it's kind of like a circuit that's just funneling people through this thing. And I guess, you know, casinos, which, you know, light is controlled, it's about kind of controlling people's experiences. The kind of commercialization of the art gallery model is something that's prevalent now.
I lament that hugely. I understand if in front of certain artworks, Mona Lisa, The Kiss, whatever it might be, around the world, you may need to have very small portions where people are funneled in and out just to keep the huge traffic moving. But other than that, for me, the joy of an art gallery is kind of, you know, darting around the place, lingering in front of some artworks for seconds, and then spending 15 minutes getting up close and personal with something else. And I think if you feel like you're on a conveyor belt, it can take away that joy.
Absolutely, yeah, it can. I mean, there are different types of institutions which serve different functions. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with creating large museums that cater for large numbers of people. When it begins to affect the curation of the artwork, or when choices are made about what to show based on audience numbers, perhaps that's where it begins to, let's say, affect the value or quality. I mean, sometimes the most interesting galleries are actually buildings that weren't really meant to be art galleries. If you have spaces that aren't perfect, sometimes they're even more interesting settings for works of art. So, yeah, the hyper-controlled, fine-tuned circuit type of gallery. I don't know actually whether they're that useful sometimes, but
just takes away the enchantment. And I lament that hugely.
Yeah. I think, for me, what's important is that there's always a variety. And I think that's why I love London so much, is that it has such an incredible variety of gallery and institution. It's, really remarkable here.
So what happened once you graduated from the AA? Where did you go next?
I worked for a while for an architect called Farshid Musavi. I actually did more research for her. She was doing a book on art galleries, actually, and art museums. I helped with some of her books. I had a very nice time. And then after that, I had a bit of a crisis, and I thought, well, I'm not designing anything. I want to really get into the nuts and bolts of things. And I think while I was at the AA, I was working on, student magazines, and always produced quite sort of overly intellectual projects. And then perhaps I was insecure about whether or not I could actually design anything. So I went and I wanted to go somewhere that nobody else at the AA was talking about at the time. There's a great editor called Tom Weaver, and he pointed me to 6A architects who are on Lamb's Conduit Street, and they work with art galleries and museums, and I went there, and I was very happy there for 5-6 years, something like that. It was quite a remarkable set of projects that they had. I think that they were very uncompromising with the type of client that they worked with. There were, from community centers on the one hand to large new galleries like Milton Keynes Museum or the Ravens Row Gallery, which was built for the Sainsbury, Alex Sainsbury. Or there were incredible interactions with really interesting clients. In fact, I remember those one clients came, and ordinarily one might expect a client to come and give you a brief and say, well, I want this number of bedrooms and this type of kitchen or whatever. And one of the clients, who was an artist, came and said, well, I don't know exactly. I want a studio and maybe some flats, but here are some photographs that I took. And one was a stack of apple crates, and another one was a stack of concrete blocks in the desert that she had taken on a trip or something like that. And we're like, okay, well, we can work with this. So I sort of interpreted that and created a building out of it. So I think they were working. I sort of learned in those years about how actually quite often it's the client who brings the richness and gives you those kind of seeds for the project. It's not your individual genius that produces a great building. It always comes from the client.
And it's an irony and a truism that constraints breed creativity, not the other way around.
Completely. And why would you not want... you can see them as constraints, or you can see it just as your palette. or, you know, like a chef making a dish. Those are your ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, every project is a little bit like Ready, Steady, Cook in that sense, you know.
Blank page would scare me.
Yeah.
But someone coming to me with something esoteric, notionally unrelated, like a picture of apple crates in the middle of the desert. It allows you to dance that line between artistic vision and how you can construct utility from something so nebulous.
Yeah. If I think about my own practice, and this kind of biographical aspect is something that I hope that we're particularly good at, you know, finding these strands, continuing discussions, and with varying degrees of formality. Right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, we designed a shop for a menswear brand called Matalino near Oxford Street. We had asked the client all the technical questions, you know, like how many jackets do you have? How many trousers do you have? How many people do you think you expect to come into the shop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was only when there was a moment where he said, can you just bring in some of your clothes? Mm-hmm. And tell us about them. So he brought in his jackets, and you could suddenly see this spark in him. And Nathan was going through the fabric, telling us exactly where the sheep were, where the wool came from, how he used all these undyed materials. And suddenly the whole project became about really understanding the origin of all the materials of the finishes of the shop. Because even though, you know, it's a really contemporary space and he's making such traditional menswear, they feel like they work together really well. You know, it's not because materially the spirit is the same. It's always understanding your client always enriches.
I'm fascinated by the granular level of detail there. Seeing the specific garments, but also the number of garments that they might put on a specific rail.
Yeah.
Because obviously in a I'm guessing, high-end place such as this, generally, I think you don't display more than 2 or 3 of the same item, right? And then everything else is kept behind closed doors. So
yeah.
You're not just thinking about in terms of the number of rails and the number of sections. You're thinking about how many specific types of individual garments there are going to be, and then constructing the building around that. So I guess you're starting from the product rather than starting from the building and then hoping to impose the product into the building.
Yeah, completely. And in a way, shops are like galleries. So it's about creating a sense of value. So, you know, if you go to Uniqlo, the clothes will be floor to ceiling on the walls. They have the full range, multiple items of every single size, full stock, because they want you to go in, grab as much stuff as you want so the staff don't have to get you anything, and buy as much as you can. So
utility is foregrounded. And even when it comes to paying as well, you chuck everything in the in the kind of basket and it registers the barcode.
They would be happy if there no human interaction whatsoever. Whereas, you know, this is the opposite. And if relating it back to galleries, you know, when you see historically the design of art galleries, the emergence of photography and the display of photography, I think, had an impact on the way that galleries were designed. Because, you know, you'd have, you know, traditionally the sort of Royal Academy style of gallery presentation, you know, paintings all the way up the wall.
Yep.
Dents. And as soon as you do that and they have frames to mediate between the paintings. So as soon as you get photography, you know, when you look at some early exhibitions, they didn't have frames. They're just sort of next to each other. But a photograph implies a wider world. So what happens is they start moving slightly farther apart from each other. And when you get abstract expressionism and you get group shows with, I don't know, Jackson Pollock and somebody else next to each other, they don't want to be immediately next to each other because their work is a frameless and implying a wider field. So these paintings start being displayed farther and farther and farther apart from each other. And then what you get in the sort of contemporary, highly financialized, highly commercialized art world is, you know, a gallery space that might be completely abstracted with one painting like a relic, sort of really precious treatment of these individual pieces, which I think wouldn't really have occurred to somebody with a gallery in the 19th century. So
the distinction between artistic product and place is completely blurred. I think I can think of a good example. About 20 years ago, I was at the Saatchi Gallery, and I walked into this room, and I was looking around for the artwork, and I realised I was stood on it, and it was basically kind of white plinths, kind of rolled down the walls, and then I don't think I was doing anything wrong by standing on it, but it took me a while to realise what I was looking for or looking at, and so it played with the whole experience. It played with the whole perception.
Yeah, so and I think when you're designing a shop or anything like that, it's actually the same. You're playing all the same games. Actually, it's about how you make people look at things, how you make people have a sense of value, whether that's financial value or whether that's cultural value. Yeah, I think it's always how an object can work within a space, and that relationship always fascinates me, I think.
I sometimes lament, though, if I do buy a product from one of those stores, I'm thinking of, I think it's Alexander McQueen on New Bond Street here. They have this wonderful fake, but artistic tree, and then they hang certain garments from it. And of course, they've got the space and the vision to do that, and it amplifies the clothing. But if you were to buy one of those pieces and then take it home and do the Uniqlo style thing of most people's wardrobe, where everything goes in next to each other, it loses its...
Maybe you need a bigger wardrobe. That's the
bigger house. At what stage did you decide that you wanted your own architecture studio?
I think I always knew that that's something I wanted to do. When you work within a certain sphere of architecture practice and your training, it can feel incredibly personal, the way that you produce work. You're coming up with ideas, working with other people to come up with ideas. And, whether you're a senior architect or a junior architect, you're nevertheless working within a pre-existing framework of how to think about space. So after a certain number of years, as much as I, loved the projects I was working on, there was this sense that as a kind of creative project, there were limitations because there was already this structure there. So, around 2017, I finished a project which was a gallery in Bloomsbury, and then I left. It was a bit scary because, the sensible thing would be to have some jobs lined up before you leave. But I think I was so scared of not knowing, of losing that sense of my own creative trajectory that, you just jump. And then you have to spend a few years testing different things and figuring out who you are and what you're all about. There are difficult years where suddenly you have to take on a different type of responsibility, but they're kind of formative and amazing. You do some ugly things and you do some nice things, and then you slowly become more and more comfortable. That's where teaching and working with students as well. It's quite common for architects to teach because it's having employees and working with other...
The apprentice model is built into the profession.
Completely. And, ultimately, however you want to frame the profession, it's a craft. And that requires a back and forth, sharing of knowledge, passing down knowledge, training. So it's in those early years where many architects, in order to survive, teach part-time and develop their creative practice through that teaching.
So now you teach at the University of Cambridge.
Yep.
How does that differ from your commercial jobs?
I suppose I'm relatively lucky in that I think with the jobs that I've been doing, I've been able to be relatively experimental and playful and I've had clients who've let me do those things.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, sometimes I feel like I feel like a student, like I'm doing student projects, because I've been lucky enough to have that freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I think that just comes out of bloody mindedness and being a bit stubborn and always wanting to do something interesting, whether or not you're being paid enough to do that or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've taught at Cambridge, I taught at the Architectural Association, Royal College of Art. They're all what I love about the UK is they have very different schools, which have very different personalities and produce different types of architect.
What type does Cambridge produce?
Cambridge likes to produce well-rounded, very articulate professionals. I think Cambridge is very good at, introducing a student to the range of complexities that architecture has to tackle. It has the best pick of students from the whole country.
Whole world.
The whole world, yeah, indeed. So, as a teacher, it's so pleasurable because you just have these brilliant students with brilliant intellects, and they're always surprising you. I think it has the short 8-week term system.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these little sprints, right? Which is very different to where the students are having to balance writing and
reading, researching, socials.
Research, social life, hopefully not rowing because it takes too much time, but, sport.
Yes.
And, to engineering aspects. And it's a lot that they have to cope with, but it makes them incredibly organized and very proficient. If you compare that to London design schools like UCL and the AA, where you get 13 weeks you do one idea in your design studio, and then it doesn't work, you do another one and you revise it. So it's very different paces, I think, very different attitudes. I think Cambridge is about, you are a professional and you have a social responsibility.
When you're hiring for your studio, is there a type of student or a type of school that you prefer to hire from?
Ooh, that's giving away secrets. I don't know. I'm quite open, if I'm honest. I think Cambridge students are incredible, very, very skilled. Same with AA, but they're both different. An AA student will probably be, a bit more, let's say they'll pick up a new software and they can develop something and bring in some kind of technique from a different industry or something. And whereas a Cambridge student will be absolutely on top of everything, very highly organized, very clever. So they're like different types of intellect, I think.
These are broad
complement
brushstrokes,
each other.
of course, but it sounds like one is generally more higher in openness and the other type of student is more higher in conscientiousness.
Yeah,
if you want to use that personality model,
so,
which is, I think, is
you get individuals who cross over, but I think as the institutional effects.
I've sensed that too in the music schools, in the art schools, etc. Yeah. These broad brushstrokes do ring true.
Yeah.
To mix metaphors. But.
Yeah. I studied at AA. I like Cambridge, and I like the way these two systems interact. I think that there's an aspect to my practice which, on the one hand, I'm very conscientious about clients and I like delivering a good service. And on the other hand, I like challenging them and challenging myself and being a bit unpredictable. So that avant-garde aspect from the AA, I think I also enjoy.
So we met for the first time today, but we exchanged some messages beforehand, and I asked you, maybe you could tell me a little bit about your architectural philosophy. And you said you don't like to think of buildings as static objects in isolation. You like to think of them as coming from somewhere and going somewhere. And I found that fascinating. As a person who's on an existential level, I think I've always been afraid of entropy. And I think the reason why I couldn't have been an architect is that the idea of spending so much time building something beautiful, to know in my lifetime it could be taken down, or at some point it's going to fall apart anyway. I think I find that kind of existentially grating. But it seems that you lean into this process, you kind of accept that entropy. Maybe you could tell me more about that.
Completely. I think you have to accept it, otherwise you might go mad.
I know.
I mean, it's funny. I mean, we're sitting next to the, Palace of Westminster, which is this static artifact which we've been trying to keep, and now it needs this massive renovation because it could go up in flames, touch wood, at any moment. But I think as soon as I have worked a lot with heritage and heritage buildings, and it's just interesting because if you preserve them too much, then they die somehow, or they lose their life. What's beautiful about the Palace of Westminster is still being used. So I think working with old buildings a lot has made me see that, quite often, the architect understood building and delegated a lot of the building, right? So you weren't designing every little detail and specifying products. You were specifying trades. So there's somebody who just makes windows, and you know that they're going to do a much better job of doing the fine details of that window than you are going to draw. And I think something has changed where in recent decades, architecture has become about specifying products. So, you pick this tape for this insulation, and you pick this and you pick that, and you're just writing lists of products without really understanding how is that going to be maintained. In 50 years, if that facade panel falls off, are you going to need an architect and an engineer and a specialist fabricator to make that same facade panel out of aluminium and to laminate it with it? No, you're not. Somebody's going to get a piece of plastic bag and tape it on, and it's probably going to stay like that for a while until they knock the whole building down. So I don't think that's a good way to think about buildings, where it all comes from one drawing and ends up as this static thing, because I'm sorry, it's not going to stay like that forever. It's not possible. And I think that a much more interesting way to think about buildings is that they are the result of systems. That's systems of making things, trades that put things together. And if you think about a building like that, it will be maintained and it will be cared for. And it will probably survive much longer. Whether it's in exactly the same shape or not, who knows? But if the knowledge is there in the future to maintain it, then I think that you've created something that's...
What is a building? Is it the specific materials and proportions, or is it the spirit of the relation between what comprises that?
I think also in terms of sustainability, we've been building in a way that's incredibly wasteful. I don't know what the numbers are exactly at the moment, but 60% of waste is from the construction industry. We build something to be there for 20 years, gets knocked down, build a new one. It's remarkable how, when you look at architectural media right now, they're celebrating stone as though stone construction has just been discovered. And, concrete is essentially, you take limestone, you crush it up, you burn it, and you mix it, and you do all this, use a huge amount of energy to make something that is weaker than stone in compression afterwards. So you're basically taking stone, turning it into something that's kind of like stone, but not quite as good, but using a huge amount of energy. So I think...
Forgive me for the idiotic question, but why did that process come about in the first place then?
Yeah. I think on the one hand, it was sort of fetishized by modernist architects, the idea that you could design internationally using, concrete was a symbol of being able to do whatever you wanted and creating a future. on the other hand, there's also, commercial factors that you can just pour it, it's wet. There's a whole industry behind it. You can make it in any shape. You don't have to think.
I can see that for transportation.
You don't have to think about it. Stone can be expensive as labor costs go up. It's just become the way that we build. I mean, in Armenia, we're trying to build almost entirely out of stone, because in Armenia, labor costs are lower and stone is so plentiful. I mean, everywhere you go, people get circular saws and just cut out blocks of stone from the ground to build their houses because it's cheaper than concrete. So you can build 1 meter thick stone walls, huge buildings, really cheaply, which is what we're trying to do. Going back in time and looking at vernaculars that have evolved, often there's a lot of science and knowledge in those things.
How did your work in Gyumri come about?
It's actually an international competition, which I was lucky enough to win. Couldn't quite believe it. I've been running a summer school for architects in Armenia, outside of Yerevan, which is the capital, building community structures with local architecture students and international ones. The students stay in this Soviet-era observatory, and it was really classy observatory. It has an arboretum. The Armenian architects were allowed within the Soviet system for some reason to be a bit more local with their style. So they built out of stone. They built these beautiful observatory towers using all the same techniques that were used for medieval churches. These beautiful, incredible buildings, like a constellation in this arboretum in the mountains. So we stayed there with students. And I saw that there was this competition in the last week of the workshop, and I thought, oh my God, this beautiful, amazing thing. How could I miss the opportunity? And I thought I'd missed the chance, but then they last minute extended the deadline.
What did you have to do to enter the competition?
Well, we only had 2 weeks. Usually you spend a month or two on this. The brief said, just do some sketches and we'll make a long list. But I think in the studio, we got quite excited about it and just went for it and did images. And a lot of the ideas for that project came out of the teaching from the workshop. So we were looking at, there's stone lying around all over Armenia. So can you just pick it up, gather it, not pay for any of it because people want to get rid of it. And there are all these crumbling Soviet-era factories with huge, beautiful steel structures. All these very clever engineers built quite beautiful factories. And because the thing about Soviet-era factories is that they were building for the entire Soviet Union. So you get these vast, vast factories all crumbling. So, and being demolished. So we thought, well, before they're demolished, can we rescue some of the steel and reuse it? Because then you're not using any carbon. You can process these existing materials quite cheaply there and reuse them. So it was all about gathering these ingredients, thinking about architecture a bit like food. You want to know where your ingredients come from. And
the best chefs say that all the food on your plate, maybe not the wines, but the food at least, should come ideally within a 20-mile radius. And also that when you eat a dish, you should be able to count the flavors that you're experiencing. So it seems to me that it's the same thing architecturally. That
was the same idea. And then we approached acquaintance of mine who's a director at Noma, the restaurant in Denmark, which is known for its kind of like hyper-localism and experimenting with things that could be food ingredients and seeing what they produce. So what we pitched, because it was the center of Gyumri, was beautiful, very low black stone city built in the Russian Empire, which was terribly affected by a very bad earthquake in the 1980s. So this central part of the historic district where the market halls was destroyed in the earthquake, and it became an informal street market, which is charming, but actually very unhygienic and difficult to trade in. It's very cold there in the winter. So that's what the competition was for. And we said, well, the client, who was an educational charity in Armenia called Tumo, they wanted to build a culinary school with some restaurants and to rebuild the market halls. And most of the proposals had sort of plazas with cafes and things like that. But what we proposed was to have a large food garden, which we worked with Mark-Emil Hermansen on, to create a kind of culinary arboretum or orchard or an experimental garden where students could plant herbs and things like that in the middle of this big park. So it was kind of thinking about how we could bring that hinterland into the center of the cities to create that kind of connection to ingredients and where they come from.
It's the opposite to what I think you said your friend Hedley was doing.
Yeah,
There was that kind of imposition. This is very much ground up, pardon the pun.
And we never would have been able to do that proposal if I hadn't been going to Armenia for a few years doing this, knowing the region, understanding, even though I'm, my father's ethnically Armenian, I'm not from that area. I didn't grow up there. It's, that immersion and understanding what those existing systems are is something that's so important for architects, is really just tapping into existing systems, not just, doing a design, making it out of whatever material you want and dropping it somewhere.
Have you ever read Roger Scruton's writings on architecture?
No, I haven't. Yeah.
You must, because there's this sense of oikophilia, the sense of love of home that pervades all of his work. And it sounds to me like your practice is very much that grassroots, bottom-up approach, having that kind of affinity and understanding with local communities, local people, the history of a place, and letting the things emerge naturally from that, rather than other trends in architecture where you've got this utilitarian imposition. What are the prices? How much room do we have? How can we cram as much in as possible?
There is a British Indian architect called Laurie Baker who set up a school of architecture in the south of India. And Laurie Baker he started out working his wife was a doctor and worked for clinics, I think malaria clinics and things like this. And he wanted to build these clinics. And he had studied at Manchester, I think, and realized that he was trying to build buildings in the way that he'd been taught, and it was completely impossible. The labor couldn't do it, the local labor. The materials and the building systems didn't really work in those climates. So he started looking at the local vernaculars, and you mentioned a radius. So he met, it was the time when Gandhi was doing the salt marches, and he met Gandhi and had this discussion about, Gandhi said that I hope this doesn't sound too cheesy, but, the perfect village was built by a local person with materials sourced from within a 5-mile radius. So Baker thought, well, the way to make these things buildable is to focus on that radius. I think his school and the methods that he developed have built something like 20,000 structures in Kerala. So it's been hugely impactful. And you realize that if you work with those systems, then the architecture actually...
Work with the grain, not against it.
People will keep building in that way. And it's a very different way of thinking about buildings to the kind of the icon or the kind of product that it's much more as something that's exists with other things.
Well, as someone who's never thought about architecture in a consistent way for more than a few minutes at a time in my life, I must say this has been utterly fascinating. So thank you so much for speaking with me today.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. My pleasure.
Cheers.